Okay, so welcome everybody to the second of the three sessions in this mini course in Latin American Jewish theology and approaches to the divine. I am Emmanuel Fiano. I'm the co-director of the Center for Jewish Studies here at Fordham, along with my colleague, Professor Magda Tater. And we're very happy to be welcoming you today to the second of these sessions. We had wonderful responses and feedback to the first session. We're going to meet on the 13th of January for the last time with Ilan Stavans, who is Luis Sebring Professor of Humanities and Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College, the publisher of Restless Books, and a consultant to the Oxford English Dictionary. His latest book is Conversations on Dictionaries, The Universe in a Book, Cambridge University Press. His work, translated into a dozen languages, has been adapted into film, TV, radio, and theater, and you can watch online his award-winning movie, animated shorts, and TED animations on multiple subjects, including dictionaries. This academic year, Ilan is a New York Public Library Fordham University Fellow in Jewish Studies, completing a book on Hispanic anti-Semitism, on which he has spoken at Fordham at the beginning of last month. We're very happy to have him with us again today for the second class of this mini course. Like last time, the chat is enabled, so you should feel free to type in with your comments, thoughts, and questions as they come to mind. He will speak, and then we will regather for the Q&A. Ilan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Thank you, Magda. And thank you to everybody at Jewish Studies at Fordham and at the New York Public Library. And welcome to you all back to this second session. It is truly unbelievable how sometimes from one week to the next, from one session to the next, in a course like this or in a series of gatherings like this, the world can feel so dramatically different. That is unfortunately the case since we were last together on our screens. It seems that fractures have taken place. And I say this because I am especially anxious about my own country, Mexico, having been listed in the several announcements by the current administration as being next in the effort to destabilizing or transforming. I don't want to devote any aspect of today's into contemporary politics, but I cannot at the same time fail to acknowledge that the world changes rapidly, and we researchers and we students in the world react to those changes in one way or another and are transformed by them. Last session, friends, I talked about Jewish theology in Latin America, concentrating it on the crypto-Jewish converso experience in what was then called New Spain, today called Mexico. And I reflected specifically on the case of one individual, Luis de Carvajal the Younger, that was the victim of the most prominent auto de fe ever to take place in the Americas in 1596. Previous sessions, just as current sessions, are recorded for those of you who are interested. That is available. In the third session coming up next week, and I should say that I am traveling to Mexico today, and I will be reaching you all from Mexico next Tuesday. I will be focusing on liberation theology, the shaping of rabbinical Judaism in Latin America, and focusing on specifically one individual, that Rabbi Marshall Meyer, who was instrumental in building the most important rabbinical school ever to exist in the Americas. Many Jewish communities throughout to this day are fed cantors and rabbis and chaplains and others from El Seminario Rabínico Latinoamericano. It's the equivalent of the Jewish Theological Seminary, but in Buenos Aires. And I have assigned in the course material a couple of pieces by him. He was an American again, who moved to Latin America, specifically to Argentina. There is a speech/sermon that he gave in a very small quote that is also available, and I'm looking forward to reflecting on Rabbi Meyer's dilemma in shaping a theology in the Americas that speaks genuinely, autochthonally, authentically to that experience of the Jews from that region. Today, I want to concentrate on one writer, really, also an Argentine. Well, Marshall Meyer wasn't an Argentine, but he lived in Argentina for many years. And I am hoping to have enough time also, at the very least, to mention and contextualize another figure that has been important in the shaping of Jewish theology in Latin America, and that is Monsieur Chouchani or Chouchani, an emblematic, mysterious, kind of Eliyahu, Prophet Eliyahu figure that was connected with Elie Wiesel and with Emmanuel Levinas, Levinas being a phenomenologist and a crucial philosopher in the second part of the 20th century, and of course Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Prize winner, survivor of Auschwitz, and a clarion in keeping the Shoah, the Holocaust, in the memory and in the discourse of politics and religion. It might be that given the amount of material that I have myself assigned and that I want to cover for in today's session, that my opportunity to go in any depth, even though I don't want in any case to expand that too much into Monsieur Chouchani's ordeal, might be curtailed. And if that is the case, I will start the third session with him as a kind of leeway from the 60s onward to what Rabbi Marshall Meyer eventually did in Buenos Aires. So keep tuned. We will see how my time works. I remind finally everybody that I will spend the next maybe 40 minutes, 45 minutes reflecting on the theology that is presented in the oeuvre of Jorge Luis Borges. And after that, we will open it up to questions and answers. As Emmanuel said, you can use the chat at any point. And in fact, please do so. I always think of the chat as a kind of a stream of consciousness that the group has to communicate with itself. I sometimes see what people write in the chat, but clearly pay attention or hope to pay attention to what I am speaking, so I might not see everything that the rest of you see. And Emmanuel and or Magda will come back later on and select some of the reflections and open it up to more, and we will engage in a hopefully vigorous and enlightening Q&A. Let me start by telling you that Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine man of letters, is not Jewish. He could be described as a Judophile in that in his work that encompasses poetry, essays, short stories, a voluminous amount of interviews and conversations that he left behind, he constantly expresses a genuine and ongoing admiration and desire to understand the Jewish experience and goes deep beyond surfaces to appreciate the complexities of Jewish history and of Jewish religion, particularly of Jewish theology. He is kind of a rara avis or unique in that whereas many prominent writers of a non-Jewish background in Latin America seldom present any interest in the Jewish paradigm, in Jewish history, in Jewish culture, in Jewish theology. Borges is an exception. This is not an occasional theme, a piecemeal him going into different Kabbalistic and philosophical, biblical, and artistic and literary resources, but an ongoing, committed investigation into what it means to think as a Jew, to imagine oneself in the dialogue between the individual Jew, the Jews as a nation, and the divine. And as such, he opens up new vistas into the landscape of Jewish life in Latin America, specifically in Argentina. Borges, and I will be now referring to him exclusively by his last name, was born in 1899 in Buenos Aires and died in Geneva in 1986. He comes from a family of upper middle class, educated professionals. His father was very interested in psychology, in philosophy, and had a very broad and wide library in his house that covered many different topics. And on his mother's side, he came from a family that had fought during the War of Independence and at various other moments in the second part of the 19th century in struggles for nationhood in Argentina. He said often, specifically in an article, very brief, called Yo Judío, I, a Jew, that he wished this piece, I, a Jew, was published in a magazine in response to a series of attacks by anti-Semitic right-wing intellectual circles that he was spending too much time into Jewish topics. And Borges responded by, in just a few paragraphs, saying that he wished that he actually spent more time, that he had spent long hours looking for a Jewish ancestor and had failed to find one, but he wished at the bottom of his heart that he had been successful. Borges's home was one, as a child, that was divided into two languages that constantly intertwined. There was the Spanish that was spoken on the streets, Argentine Spanish, and Argentinians at that time were very proud of the Argentine Spanish language that they had developed, in distinction from Spanish from Spain that tended to be much more connected with a castizo, with a much more conservative way of using the language. But one of another language, there were several, but one of the other languages that was prominent in his home was English. And many of the first readings that Borges did were actually in the English language, because his father kept so many volumes in his home that were originally published in England and were shipped to Buenos Aires at that time. There's an interesting, curious, and provocative anecdote Borges writes about in an autobiographical essay published in the New Yorker in the early 70s, where he talks about reading for the very first time Cervantes's novel Don Quixote in English, because that was the language in which it was available. Falling in love with the book, indeed, Cervantes's Don Quixote would eventually become one of the most important books defining Cervantes's intellectual interests and galaxy of themes. And this is part of that anecdote, in that some years later, having read Don Quixote in English, he found the Spanish original, which he thought was a translation, and actually a bad translation at that. That is emblematic of Borges's back and forth with translation, where he thinks that a translation can supersede the original, can be better than the original, and that a translation can also eventually replace culturally, literarily, narratively, the status of the original. I'm saying all this because Borges is known, and rightly so, as a cosmopolitan thinker. He had broad interests that pushed him in many directions. He was interested in Spinoza's philosophy. He was interested in detective stories. He was interested in tango and gaucho life in Argentina. And he was also interested in immigration. It's important to keep in mind that Argentina had a very solid and defining Jewish immigration that took place at the very end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. I should say that I have been slightly sick with a cough, and I might use some lozenges here and there in order to keep my voice going. It should not affect you, hopefully, but indulge and pardon me if you may. From 1870, 1880 to the 1920s, a very big Jewish immigration, Ashkenazi, came to mainly Buenos Aires, but other places like La Plata as well. Poor shtetl dwellers escaping anti-Semitism, escaping poverty, had made their way across the Atlantic to Argentina at the very bottom of the South American continent. And in large part, their arrival was the result of philanthropic individuals and organizations like the Baron Maurice de Hirsch, a famous philanthropist at that time in the 1880s, and the Alliance Israélite Universelle, an organization based in France that acquired land in the Brazilian, Uruguayan, and Argentine pampas, where Jews could resettle and build a new yishuv, the word in Yiddish for a new Jewish community, replicating the model of the shtetl in the countryside, with a synagogue, a mikvah, a cemetery, a Yiddish language school. And Borges, who was an urbanite, to the best of my knowledge, he never visited the Pampas and exchanged any serious dialogue with the newly arriving Jewish immigrants that were coming, Yiddish speakers that were coming from Eastern Europe, nonetheless wrote in his short stories and in his essays about gauchos. The gaucho is an Argentine type, somewhat similar to the cowboy, that dresses in a particular way, produces a kind of musical and poetic folklore, and is known to be a free spirit who is eventually transformed into a symbolic representative of the Argentine Republic. Borges wrote about the gauchos, what is to America Leaves of Grass, the centrality of Walt Whitman's poetry collection. In Argentina is called El Gaucho Martín Fierro, the Gaucho Martín Fierro by José Hernández. And the gaucho is an allegory of that free spirit Argentine who will resist colonial invasions, who will have his own morality. Borges was particularly interested in the connection between Jews that were arriving to the Pampas and the gauchos, and often wondered if there was such a thing as a Jewish gaucho. If the Jews in the Pampas, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, had assimilated enough to the rural environment to result in a truly synthetic archetype that would be a Yiddish-speaking gaucho, singing videlitas and tangos and other types of songs, telling stories, but from a Jewish twist. And he didn't write that many pieces about this, but they are significant. And ultimately, Borges reached the conclusion that it was just an effort at adapting to the environment, but that the syncretism, the transculturation between the two sides, the gaucho side in the Pampas and the Yiddish-speaking immigrant that had just arrived, never fully resulted into a middle ground that offered something new and different. Borges wished by the end of his life, he died at the age of 86, that he would be remembered as a poet. He had put his best efforts in writing sonnets, rhymed poetry that he believed was the best expression of who he was. We have many terrific poems by Borges, and many poems that engage in an exploration of Jewish theology. There is a beautiful poem that Borges writes about Spinoza polishing glasses. Spinoza supported himself by creating some of the early optical glasses for people to use in Amsterdam. He has a beautiful poem about the golem, a mythical figure connected with the Maharal of Prague that Borges was infatuated with. And one of the distinctions of that poem, the golem by Borges, is that the word golem in Spanish is really very difficult to rhyme with anything because there are very, very, very few words that end in L-E-M. But Borges savvily and very creatively, in having gone to Israel for the very first time, one of two trips, in one of them, he was the recipient of the Jerusalem Prize. And in the other one, this one that I'm referring to, he met Gershom Scholem, the scholar of the Kabbalah. He rhymes Scholem or golem with Scholem, which is, for those of us who are in the know of how the studies on Kabbalah and on the golem in particular have evolved during the last 50 to 100 years, find this to be absolutely amusing. There are also poems about biblical figures that Borges wrote that engage with trying to understand the divine, and three very significant poems about Israel as a modern nation. In 1948, Borges was 49 years old. He was fascinated by the emergence of this new Jewish nation that wanted to normalize Jewish life, but he was also very puzzled by it. He couldn't quite understand, and genuinely so, he couldn't quite understand why diaspora Jews, and he admired the quality of the Jew as a diaspora character who is able to travel from one landscape to another, often escaping persecution or poverty, but in doing so, learns the language of the environment, adapts and absorbs elements from that environment, and produces a culture that is both Jewish and native to that part. He was infatuated with that capacity for Jews in the former Czechoslovakia, for instance. He adored Kafka, being able to produce something like Kafka's novel, The Metamorphosis, or the Trial. The same thing with Spinoza in Amsterdam, or the Second World War and the Nazis, the role of the Nazis in a variety of places in Europe. And though he celebrated the national spirit of Zionism and received the Jerusalem Prize and was close to a variety of figures in Israel, including Shmuel Yosef Agnon, whom he met, had won the Nobel Prize, and he lectured on in his oeuvre in Buenos Aires. He still preferred the diaspora Jew because he saw himself, Borges, as a diaspora character that loved the capacity to be transient, itinerant from one culture to another. Of the many texts that I gave you, in total 4, I think, or 5, there is one lecture that Borges delivered in Buenos Aires at the very beginning of the 1950s, called The Argentine Writer and Tradition, that is very important in trying to understand a number of things: the gaucho character, what makes Argentine literature Argentine, meaning different from other literatures, but also the role of Jews in Western civilization. I hope you had an opportunity to read it. I am going to read just a little passage from this lecture that he delivered. It's a transcribed version. It has been edited because it shows the type of infatuation and admiration that Borges had for diaspora Judaism, and it shows us the twist that allowed Borges to see diaspora Jews as strategically positioned to create something that would outlast both the native culture in which they exist and themselves, the Jews at that particular time. Again, this comes from the lecture, The Argentine Writer and Tradition, and this is just a few lines. What is Argentine literature? Borges asks. I believe that this question poses no problem and can easily be answered. I believe that our tradition is the whole of Western culture. And also, I believe that we have a right to this tradition, a greater right than that which the inhabitants of one Western nation or another might have. I'm interrupting here my reading of the quote for a second. He stresses the fact that what makes Argentine literature authentic is not that it writes about gauchos or something of local color, but that it has the capacity to write about anything and everything, just as Shakespeare did. If Shakespeare could write about the Jews of Italy in The Merchant of Venice, or about the Jews of the inhabitants of Africa, or about the histories of the various monarchies in Scotland and in England, why couldn't Argentine Jews write about anything and everything that they want, meaning a Russian character, a character that is alive and well in the Middle Ages in the Netherlands, so on and so forth. And he adds, and I'm quoting again, "Here I remember an essay by Thorstein Veblen, the North American sociologist, on the intellectual preeminence of Jews in Western culture. He wonders if this preeminence authorizes us to posit an innate Jewish superiority, and answers that it does not. He says that Jews are prominent in Western culture because they act within that culture and at the same time do not feel bound by that culture. Therefore, he says, it will always be easier for a Jew than for a non-Jew to make innovations in Western culture." To summarize, and this is quite a remarkable statement, Borges suggests that what makes diaspora Jews unique and extraordinarily endowed to produce significant contributions to Western civilization. Notice the way in the middle of the 20th century, he's emphasizing the concept of Western civilization that in more recent times, closer to us and to the present, has come under heavy attack, is that the Jew is both an insider and an outsider. In that capacity to be amphibious, to live in two worlds, to have one foot in one and one foot on the other, allows Jews the enviable position of understanding very clearly what is happening outside a particular environment, but not being bound by that environment, being freed from that environment precisely because of their outsiderness. And that explains, this is the corollary of Borges, why there are so many Nobel Prize winners, famous Jewish writers, famous Jewish musicians that have both produced work that fits into the Jewish cultural tradition and into the respective traditions of their own countries. I am moving now to the theology that Borges presents in a number of short stories. This was a lecture, and it could be understood also as an essay. I said that Borges wished he had been, he would be remembered especially as a poet, but it is as an essayist and certainly as a short story writer that he is remembered the most and has been incredibly influential. He is one writer that has not only redefined the map of Latin American intellectual life, Latin American religious life, including the Jewish theology, but also Western civilization as a whole. It's impossible to think of writers like Toni Morrison or Salman Rushdie, writers from England and Italy and Umberto Eco, in France and Spain and many others that many other countries that have been under the influence of Borges. Why that influence? Well, it has to do with two levels. The first level is Borges's language, his style, the way he wrote in Spanish. Borges in Spanish has a mathematical approach to sentence shaping. One, maybe because of that decisive early influence of English in his upbringing, one often, as a Spanish speaker, has the impression of, when reading Borges, thinking that he is imagining his stories in words that come from English, but producing the story in Spanish. The Spanish language can be very romantic in that it can have an abundance of adjectives and nouns and adverbs. Borges instead wants to make it succinct, wants to make it very concrete, wants to anglicize the Spanish language. For that reason, I think translating Borges from Spanish into English is both very easy and very difficult. Very easy because one has the impression that this material has already been thought out in this language, but very difficult because it is not written in English. He could have written it in English, and indeed he wrote a couple of poems in English, and some of his the conversations and interviews he left behind were also in English. And you can see the different Borges when he writes in English and when he writes in Spanish, and they are notably and even notoriously different in terms of sensibility and texture. And the second, because of the themes he chose in his short stories. I will be talking, friends, about three, and I added a fourth thanks to Magda, that was put also in the syllabus. So I'm going to be talking about Death and the Compass, La Muerte y la Brújula. I'm going to be talking about the Aleph, arguably Borges's most famous and influential story, and two other stories where his theology is specifically clear, tangibly clear. One is called The Secret Miracle, and the other one is called Emat Zuns. Let me start with Death and the Compass. I will spend less time in it than in the other stories, but I think it is essential in our understanding of Jewish theology in Latin America and Jewish theology according to Borges. This is, first and foremost, a detective story. Borges loved detective stories, loved detectives because they are pursuers of truth, and they understand the world as sending us signals that ultimately can be read, can be deciphered, and can be turned into some kind of explanation. In this, Borges is constantly including in his detective fiction the fact that the best mind of all is not the mind of the detective, but the mind of God, that is sending messages to us and to the detective to be deciphered. This is a story that takes place in a mythical city that is unnamed, but in many ways, in a fashion, resembles Buenos Aires, but it is also very similar to Amsterdam. And because of that, the story has been considered a tribute to Spinoza, again, a Jewish philosopher and theologian that Borges admired thoroughly. The main character is a detective, not Jewish, and he very quickly starts to follow a series of assassinations, killings that take place in the city, and all of the victims in this assassinations that take place are Jewish in one way or another. Red Scarlac is the enemy, the arch enemy of the detective, the kind of alter ego, the nemesis, and the detective is Eric Lundroth. The word itself is a tribute to the color red, and the color red permeates the entire story. As we follow the plot, Lundroth discovers that the first one of the killings took place in one of the four cardinal points of the city on a particular date of the month. And when the second killing takes place, it is in another cardinal point, north, south, east, and west, on the same date of the following month. There's a third killing that takes place, and it is the following month, and also on the same date in another of the 4 cardinal points. And this leads Lonroth to conclude that there's going to be a 4th killing, and that one is in the last remaining cardinal point in the city. So if he has been to the north and to the south and to the east, he now has to go to the west. That all of the characters are Jewish, and not because there's a particularly anti-Semitic animus against them, but because the killer, the assassin, wants to send a message that is connected with God, particularly with the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of the divine, Yahweh, or the kind of articulation of that name into Jehovah. In every one of the 3 sites where the killing takes place, the killer disappears, but not before having written on a letter or on a mirror or on some other item, the first letter of the name has been uttered, which means that there's a coincidence of 4 geographical locations, 4 dates, and also that there's a coincidence of the 4 letters, in that the last letter of the name of God will now be written in the final site where the conclusive killing takes place. This leads Lonroth to identify that location. He goes, and of course, he finds out that he is the last victim, and that Red Scarlet has devised the entire thing in order to bring him and take revenge against a previous encounter that they had where Lonroth emerged triumphant. So it's a story of revenge, and it's a story where the detective has been set in order to become the last and conclusive victim of this theological organization of the world, of time, and of geography. And at the very end of the story, there's a dialogue between the 2 of them, detective and killer, where the detective tells the killer, "You set me up, you were shrewder than I am, you built a labyrinth for me that is actually a straight line." This is one of the most beautiful conclusions of a story by Borges. A labyrinth, Borges, like Kafka, was fascinated by labyrinths. And he says a labyrinth can be a structure made of twists and turns, but it can also be a dot, it can be a line. And he asks, Lonroth asks Red Scarlet, in the future life, in wherever the souls go, to meet again and maybe devise a more ingenious and provocative labyrinth. In other words, being tongue-in-cheek, laughing at all of this. Where does all this go? I think it goes to show how Borges is very connected to the central theological questions of how to name the divine. Several of the victims are Kabbalists or are rabbis. The story is set not in Argentina, but in a landscape that looks pseudo-European and has a theology at the center. And that theology is really about connecting the world, the celestial world, with a human and natural world, and how both of them are mirrors of each other. I will stop there. We can go in the Q&A and explore more of this short story. The second story that I want to talk to you about, I will also go quickly. It's an incredible story. I mentioned the Aleph. It's one of the most influential stories by Borges. On the surface, it doesn't connect directly with theology, but when you go deep into the story, you see that that is at the center of it. It is a semi-autobiographical story in that a character called Borges appears in the story and narrates the story. It is about him having fallen in love with a woman called Beatriz Viterbo, who recently died. He is bereaved. He is going through all kinds of depressive and sad moods and is in quick need of some kind of redemptive aspect. He is a poet who visits the cousin of Beatriz in a multi-level house in Buenos Aires. There seems to be a rivalry between the cousin and Borges, in that recently the cousin was awarded a national prize for a poem that he wrote that is about looking at the entire world as a labyrinth. And Borges thinks very poorly of that poem and feels that he, as a poet, has been sidestepped and not really celebrated the way he thinks he should have been. He has also produced a book of national stature, but the committee that gave the national prize gave it to Beatriz's cousin, and he feels envious. And at one point in their conversations, the cousin, Carlos Argentino Daneri, and Borges talk about a very mysterious object that is in the basement of Carlos Argentino Daneri's house, and that Daneri calls the Aleph. Of course, it's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The Aleph in Spanish, if it wasn't for this short story by Borges, not many people that are without access to education would know what it means, but the story has had such an impact that everybody now relates that first letter of the Hebrew alphabet to the story. At one point, this is the central part of the story, it comes through at the end, Borges is invited to Daenerys' house and goes to the basement and discovers in front of his eyes this very small, circular, spherical object, no bigger than 3 centimeters, that is right in front of his eyes as he descends. And he says that now his story comes to the most challenging moment. How is he going to describe in words, in language, an object that encompasses the entire universe in it, where everything happens simultaneously in the Aleph, through a language like Spanish, like any human language, that is actually successive and chronological. In order to describe anything, we need to begin a sentence, have a middle, have an end, and build paragraphs. But if he were to do justice to the description of this object, he would have to create a new language where every word is concurrent and simultaneous with all the other ones, because that is exactly what the Aleph is all about. I don't have time, I really wish I did, to read that extraordinary paragraph. Maybe the Spanish language exists just for Borges to have had the chance, the opportunity to write that description of the Aleph. It's a list. Borges loved lists where he says everything that he saw when he focused on that 3-centimeter object, the Aleph. And it goes more or less like this, friends. I saw my face and I saw your face. I saw Beatriz. I saw Guadalajara. I saw Alexander the Great in one of his conquests. I saw an enormous river and a tiger. I saw the tears of ancient slaves. I saw. And the sheer succession, accumulation, all in the present tense, and the repetition of I saw, the esto, the aquello, gives us a sense that this list goes nowhere and goes everywhere, and that for the very first time, an object manages to do exactly what God does, which is to see the entire world, past, present, and future, simultaneously, concurrently, not chronologically. And it allows Borges to reflect on questions of language. What is the difference between Lashon HaKodesh, the language of God, the holy language, the sacred language, and Lashon Bnei Adam, the human languages that need, by definition, to be imperfect, need to be temporal, needs to reflect a particular moment and then go on. This is, through a short story, a superb disquisition on the power of the divine, the power of language, and the use of science fiction elements. Borges said that he was very influenced by H.G. Wells, and that the idea of the Aleph came from a short story by H.G. Wells. It allows us to see how Borges is fascinated by theology and by philosophy, but what he does is adapt them all into fiction. Again, maybe we will have time to talk about this in the Q&A. I have limited, I want to compress the next two stories in the next 10 minutes because I really want to have an opportunity to talk with you. One of the stories is called The Secret Miracle, El Milagro Secreto. It's a story of a translator and a scholar in 1939 who is arrested by the Nazis because he's Jewish, and he is taken to a cell where he is told that the next day he is going to be executed because, again, of his Jewish background. His name is Jaromir Hladek. The story begins with a dream, and eventually when Hladek is in his, or some people pronounce it Hladik, when he is in his prison, in his cell, Hladek has a dialogue with God. And in that dialogue with God, he says, and I summarize, this is not verbatim, God, if I am more than one of your creatures, if I justify you and you allow me to justify myself, please, before I die, let me finish my magnum opus, the play The Enemies. It is the reason I was born, how I have seen every single day of my life. Without it, I am nothing. In the dialogue, at the very end, we hear that God tells Hladek that his wish has been granted. And then the next morning, he is woken up by the Nazis, taken to be in front of a firing squad. And another beautiful scene in Borges takes place. The Nazis are with the rifles in front of him. Hladek is nervous. He sees a bee flying, projecting a shadow on some of the plants that are near him. He moves away from the wall in order for his blood not to mess up the wall after he gets shot. And he sees the smoke coming out from one of the soldiers that is in the firing squad. And then we're told that the general or the lieutenant says, ready, shoot. And just as the the shooting takes place, the universe freezes. And that section is mesmerizing. Borges might have been inspired in a famous short story by Ambrose Bierce, an occurrence in Old Creek Bridge that also freezes the universe. And what happens in the story is that Borges, the Hladik, realizes that everything is immobile, is set. The bee now projects a static shadow. The smoke from the cigarette is frozen. And he comes to the conclusion that God has granted him that secret miracle, el milagro secreto, to finish his play. In just a few minutes, he will have an entire year in which mentally he will be able to conclude his masterpiece. And lo and behold, he does it. He puts the last dot, the final word into the enemies. And then the very last sentence of the story is that Hladik died in front of the firing squad on a particular time and a particular date. And that's the end. I very quickly ask, dear friends, can a miracle be secret? Do miracles need to be public and open? Can you finish something in your mind that has no physical evidence in the natural world? Does Hladik truly conclude his masterpiece, the enemies, or is this all an intellectual game? Why does Borges choose a Jewish character to go through this ordeal? And would the same effect of the story carry on if the character was not Jewish? And this leads me to the final story, Emma Zuns. The same question, why is Emma Zuns Jewish? And in what way is Jewish exploring Jewish theology? The story of Emma Zuns is the story of, it's one of the only stories that Borges wrote from the perspective of a woman. It's in the third person, but it's in the perspective of a young woman who at the very beginning of the story finds out that her father has recently committed suicide. She knows that this is not a suicide that resulted from depression, but that the father was pushed to that suicide by his business partner, and that the business partner pushed him out of the business and led the father to that terrible ending. Emma Zuns knows that no one will ever find out that the father didn't die because of a self-inflicted gunshot, but that there is a cause behind it. In other words, that there will never be social justice and human justice to the death of her father. She is the only one in the know that the partner is the cause of this. And so the essence of the story now unfolds. Emma, who's a virgin, and I should say here that Borges was given this short story as an anecdote by one of his female friends, and then he transformed it, he changed the title, the name of the characters, gave it a title, and so on. And being a virgin, she decides to go to the pier where she finds a sailor who can, with whom she can lose her virginity. In the rape scene, she at one point sees one sailor with whom she thinks she could feel some empathy or affection and chooses not to go with that anonymous individual, but go with somebody for whom she's not going to feel any connection whatsoever. That rape scene is very brief, but very shocking, and it's crucial to the short story. And then Emma Zuns leaves and goes to the office of the partner, the business partner of the father. She arrives when there is a strike that has been going on. She makes her way to the office of the factory where the business partner is. They speak in Yiddish, and she claims that he is the one that actually raped her. Takes a gun, she knows about the existence of this gun, from a drawer in one of the desks, shoots him, kills him, and then calls the police and says he tried to take a physical sexual advantage of me. I defended myself. I had to kill him. And the very last line of the story is, in essence, what Emma Zuns said is true. She was taken advantage of, but it was the person, the name, the date, and other circumstances that were different. So the question, friends, here is, again, why does Borges choose a Jewish character to engage in this theological quest to bring justice to herself and to her father? Why does she need to lose her virginity? Could she have pretended to lose her virginity? What does the pain that comes from the violation, from the rape, originate in her? And why does she feel that she has ultimately brought justice, finally, to the death of her father? I conclude here, friends, wrapping things up and hoping that we can now engage in a dialogue. These are 4 short stories by Borges where Jewish characters are either victims or are the ones that bring in justice or that are in constant and direct dialogue with God. In Latin America, where we have many hybrid texts, the way we often engage with philosophy and theology is through fiction and poetry and essays, and there is hardly a better example than Borges. I finish here by saying that these stories have been translated many times into English, have influenced many people, including many Latin American writers, and finally, that many non-Jews in Latin America actually know about Jews, about the Jewish God, about Kabbalah, about the Golem, about Jewish morality, thanks to this non-Jew who was so obsessed, so infatuated with Jewish themes. Thank you for your patience, and back to you, Emmanuel.
Thank you so much, Ilan. And this is the time for us to invite everybody to put in their questions in the chat. We'll be reading them. Ilan will be selecting them and answering them. Maybe I could start with a question. In the meantime, you have started our meeting today by contextualizing it in our political and geopolitical moment. So I feel I can be perhaps forgiven for asking a question about Borges' politics. Borges has been often and famously criticized for his shift from his erstwhile sort of Spencerian anarchism towards, as he became a public persona, public figure, towards the right. There's this famous lunch with Videla, the Argentine dictator. And this has also been the grounds for his rejection by many Argentine intellectuals, among whom was Juan Gelman, arguably the foremost Jewish literatus of Argentina, certainly the foremost Jewish poet. So I guess my question is, in which way, if at all, you see Borges' politics as commenting on his relationship to Judaism or uncommented upon by his relationship to Judaism, especially to the extent that that admiration for a closeness to Judaism and Jewishness is largely mediated by a notion of tradition that finds different kinds of liberation in Israel.
A notion of tradition, beautiful image. I very much appreciate, Emmanuel, this question. It really helps me to give an even more round portrait of Borges himself. Yes, Borges has often been criticized for a number of different reasons. One of them is being too cerebral, too hyper-intellectual, that his characters are not fully human or humane, but are figureheads for actions or ideas that he has. I don't fully agree with this view, but I can see certainly the roots in the enduring debates that it has generated. Another severe and I think pertinent criticism that Borges has received is that he, in a continent often defined by radical politics, especially left-wing politics, and in Argentina, where those politics can either take a populist side, as in the case of Perón, which was a kind of Maduro, Hugo Chavez figure connected with Evita, and a military strongman who ruled Argentina for a number of years, to a more conservative, often church-based view of politics that was decidedly to the right. Borges repeatedly answered throughout his life that he was apolitical, that politics did not interest him. But of course, in a continent like Latin America, and probably anywhere in the world, even saying that you're not political is a political statement, where everybody else is looking to bring social and economic justice, saying that you're not interested in such things and that they are a delusion from the left, and the left really dislike Borges. It might be facetious and somewhat naive. It is said that Borges did not receive the Nobel Prize because of a trip that he made to Chile, where he shook the hand of Pinochet, a general that had orchestrated a coup in 1973 and that ruled the country for many years. Borges was, or at the very least, appeared to be disinterested in such things. He believed that strong men often had more of a capacity to rule a landscape that could, in his view, easily go astray in democratic or socialist experiments. Interestingly, Borges very, very seldom talks about democracy. He is not interested in the democratic experiment. And in part, this has to do with the fact that he lived most of his life under dictatorship, under Perón and others, but it's also a stigma and a sign of his own upbringing. I should say here, Emmanuel, that Argentine Jews are themselves divided as a community between a more conservative side that empathize and sympathize with Borges and was close to Perón and to the military junta in the 1960s and 70s. I will be talking about this next, in the final third session, and a very left-wing, mostly young and youthful side of the Jewish community that has been connected with socialist, communist currents, political and intellectual. A very high number of the desaparecidos in Argentina during the Guerra Sucia or the Dirty War were of Jewish descent. Again, I will be talking about this when we reflect on Marshall Meyer, who took a very active role in defending them. All to say that it's absolutely true what you're saying, and even successors of much literary prominence, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who won the Nobel Prize from Colombia, and Carlos Fuentes, and Julio Cortázar, and Mario Vargas Llosa, all very prominent writers of the Latin American boom, admire Borges intellectually, but distanced themselves politically, thinking that Borges was too conservative and too hyper-intellectual and unconcerned with the day-to-day struggle of the people in Argentina.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We begin to see questions in the chat. There's a question by our colleague Marilyn Miller and past Fordham Jewish Studies fellow, Professor Miller, who writes that she teaches Emma Zuns frequently in her Spanish classes and finds the term ultraje to be interesting and crucial, as it is a more delicate way to speak of rape and also has a wider sense. And she asks whether you could say some more about the theme of social justice in relation to Jewish characters and topics.
Yes. Dr. Miller, I'm very appreciative, and I love the questions that you've been asking last session and this session. I myself, as you could imagine, teach Emma Zuns frequently, and I am especially attuned as a result to the changing interpretations that the short story elicits as one exposes young people of different generations to it. It is a story that is, in my experience, understood very differently by female readers because it is about rape and a self-inflicted wound in order to bring forth social justice than by male readers. And as we, in the last maybe 10, 20 years, have become finally much more attuned to the plight of women in Latin America. Not that it wasn't happening there, but that it has become much more open in the rhetorical landscape of feminicides, rape, sexual abuse. The story has acquired added meaning. Yes, there are many elements in the story, particular uses of the word, like the word traje, that is often what happens with Borges. A certain word can push you into this direction or that direction, or can make you see very differently. And of course, the facade of a character is very different to what that character is going through internally. One of the beauties of this story and one of the beauties of The Secret Miracle is that they are stories that enable us to see the outside existence of a character and then the inner existence of a character, running more or less parallel, but changing in response to all kinds of forces around. I don't know. I mean, this is a story that is, on the one hand, very Borgesian. I can't think of anybody writing the story in this particular way. And on the other hand, very unique in the constellation of Borges' short stories. As I mentioned, I think all in all, depending on how you count them, there are only 2 stories that have female protagonists. There are many stories with female characters, but the vast majority of them play a very small role. This one has a female character that is very prominent, and together with it, very, very, very seldom are there sexual scenes or sexual references, at least overtly, in the works of Borges. He seems to have been a very prudish man who did not want to talk about such things. There were rumors in Latin America. Borges lived the vast majority of his life with his mother, who was a secretary for him, helping him transcribe some of the work, especially as he became blind at the age of 50. And he married twice, once in his 50s to a woman he barely knew, mainly because of rumors that were circulating in Argentina of his homosexuality that he wanted to react to by getting married. The marriage only lasted, I think, 7 or 8 months. And then at the very end of his life, to one of his former students, Maria Kodama, who became the heir and leader of the foundation that to this day, she died not too long ago, handles all the rights and permissions for Borges. So a story where we have a female character that wants and seeks her own rape is absolutely unique and for that reason very perplexing. Stories in Borges about social justice are unique and very few and far between. He's not interested in social justice. He's interested in morality. He's interested in ethics writ large, and he is interested in the connection between the higher spheres and the human or natural spheres. So it's a story, Stavans, that pushes us into new horizons. In many ways, allowing us to reinterpret Borges. But again, it's a story that came to him from one of his female friends, and he adapted it. So it's in some ways foreign and alien to him. I find it just extraordinary, the story itself. And the fact that as a non-Jew, as a man, he makes the main character Stavans. I should stress finally, or at least point out, that just as in Death and the Compass has the Tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God, at its center, the name of Stavans is the name and last name are both made of 4 letters, and in each of them 2 repeat. The M repeats and the Z repeats. So I think there is some kind of secret message or some kind of connection there with the name of God. Stavans is also a famous scholar of German Jewish studies in the 19th century that opened up the field in new directions. Borges was very attuned to even slight echoes of a name. And I think all those are significant in our interpretation. Leopold Stavans.
Thank you, Ilan. There is a comment in the chat about the polarization of Jewish diaspora and the connoisseur more widely. Unless you wanted to address that, I perhaps had another question for you.
Sure.
Which is kind of a casual reader's of uninformed impression. So I'm curious what you think about this. In particular, what you mentioned ethics. I'm curious about what you envision as the relationship between what attracts Borges to Judaism and to Jewishness, and what for us and for anybody who is interested in the present and the future of Judaism and Jewry can be productive about the glance that he, as an outsider, but a strange outsider because he's an self-identified, or somebody who identifies with Judaism in a way, casts the glance that he casts on Judaism. And the reason why that question seems to pose itself to me is that there are aspects of the Jewish tradition, such as redemption or the focus on textuality, that it's very easy to see why he's attracted by or drawn towards. But at the same time, and that's really the most uninformed part of the question, one gets the impression that we kind of go from Spinoza, we leap from Spinoza to Ben Gurion, that there is a very central part of Jewish modernity, which is the tradition of ethical monotheism from Hermann Cohen to Buber, Levinas, etc. That's not really there or present, and so I wonder first if that's true, and regardless, what about Borges, whom you chose, of course, over other Jewish writers that you could have chosen, or Alejandra Pizarnik, or whatever, that you see as particularly productive for Judaism today?
Terrific question. And maybe I can begin answering it by telling you, Emmanuel and friends, that as a Mexican Jew who grew up in the 60s, and by then Borges, when I was a very, very, very young child, Borges began to acquire first a regional, then a national, then a continental, and eventually a global following. I truly learned to be a Jew through reading Borges. I find this to be somewhat ironic. I grew up Jewish in a Jewish household, reading the Talmud, reading the Bible, going to synagogue, following the rituals, engaging in this tradition. And yet it was a non-Jew in Argentina that finally had made it to Mexico through writing that really taught me to imagine what it means to be a Spanish language writer that can write about anything that they want. And I go back here to the reference of the Argentine writer and tradition. I have personally taken it to heart that not because I'm a Latin American Jew, a Mexican Jew, do I only need to write about the landscape I come from or the characters that define my childhood. In many ways, Borges helped me to find liberation in the topics and feel that the Western tradition and other traditions, the tradition of Sufism and Hinduism, the traditions of science fiction and detective fiction, belong to me as a Latin American as much as they belong to a British writer or an American writer. I cannot speak with more depth and celebration, if only of that part of Borges. And I feel that depth to be very integral to me. Yes, Borges loved the concept of intertextuality, the fact that the world is a text, and that in Judaism, the world travels, the text travels with us as a home from one diaspora to another. Borges loved the idea that we should not be tied by the language of our environment, but we should amplify the different languages that we speak and engage with those environments because they are as much ours as they are of any native speaker. And toward the end of his life, he was fascinated by medieval Germanic mythologies. He was interested in early English and in the English of Chaucer. And he started studying Hebrew, not contemporary Hebrew, but biblical Hebrew. And I think that this is an opportunity to think of what Jews have been doing for long stretches of time, as seen in the kind of reverse mirror by a non-Jew that falls in love with many of these traditions and then adapts them and turns them into artifacts and channels and doors that will enable him to become fully cosmopolitan, fully translingual, and fascinated by languages. I find my own interest in translation also to be deeply rooted in Borges. The fact that we are not tied by the language of our upbringing. We can learn new languages. We can write in languages that are not our own, and that not because you come from a particular experience are you caged or imprisoned by that experience. Very, very important to me. Not surprisingly, Emmanuel, there has been a big backlash in Argentina of people asking, is Borges really an Argentine writer? Did he end up renouncing what it means to be an Argentine and becoming a writer of so many places as to be of no place at all? I can see particularly in the 21st century, in our hyper-nationalism, this tension being even more exacerbated. You have to pledge loyalty to certain icons and figures and symbols in order to be part of a national tradition. But in that sense, Huckleberry Finn, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, to me is also an emblematic Borgesian text. Can a writer who is not Black write about the Mississippi slave experience and create slang that is not fully accurate and yet replicates what the character of Jim, a runaway slave, and a little child, Huck, are going through as they navigate the Mississippi? Twain was severely criticized for inventing this language that doesn't belong to anybody, for not being fully accurate, for not being ethnographic or anthropological in the extent that he needed. But I don't see that. I see actually a rather liberating exercise. And Hemingway once said that the beginning, the ground zero of American literature is this little book called Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So to conclude, Borges is going to test our nationalism. He's going to test our patriotism, and he is going to push for a cosmopolitan global view of things that may not be popular these days or might not be in power of these days. But precisely because of that is very much at the heart of what the Jewish experience is. And if he could go from Spinoza to Ben-Gurion, clearly endorsing Spinoza and being suspicious, reverential to Ben-Gurion, but being suspicious of why do we want a state when we can be stateless, and stateless in his perception is good. I think we'll come back to a time in the future where understanding diasporism as an alternative, not one that negates the state of Israel, but it's concurrent or simultaneous with the state of Israel, is going to enable us to see things that in the present we don't see fully.
Thank you, Ilan. Maybe we'll try to take one more question, one last question. Abigail Ortega from Chile writes, I don't know if this fits with the discussion, but I was curious about Jewish Latin American writers during the dictatorships. Are there authors who wrote directly about those experiences?
Just repeat the last part. I missed the last part.
So she was wondering if there are authors who wrote directly, Jewish authors who wrote directly about their experiences during the dictatorship.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, I have chosen Borges, and you and I were talking about Borges because I wanted to explore theology and the theology that Borges presents. But Latin America has a very rich and varied literary tradition that goes back to the colonial period, and especially in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, there are many writers in Chile, in Jewish writers, in Chile, in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Brazil, in Cuba, in Colombia, that criticize or align themselves with the dictatorship. Let me just give some examples. There is Moacir Scliar. I'm going to be in a reading book club that we have coming up with the Jewish Studies at Fordham. We're going to be reading one of his books called The Center in the Garden. There is Ariel Dorfman in Chile, a playwright, novelist, and a newspaper columnist who wrote a celebrated play called Death and the Maiden about the dictatorship of Pinochet. There are many writers in Argentina that wrote against Perón and against the junta. Next week, I'm going to be talking about a famous journalist, Jacobo Timerman, author of Prisoner Without a Name, Cell Without a Number, who was imprisoned by the dictatorship and eventually needed to leave the country, lived in Israel for a while, and eventually came back. That was an outspoken critic of the junta. Similarly, there are Jewish writers in Guatemala that have written about the different dictatorships. There is a very long tradition. There are a number of PhD dissertations that are currently being written, including at Yale and at Princeton, that deal with Jewish narrative voices during the dictatorships in Latin America.
Thank you. Thank you, Ilan. We managed to end by 3:30.
Yes.
Ilan has very kindly invited everybody to write to him last time to his email address, which I will let him repeat.
istavans@amherst.edu. istavans@amherst.edu. I look forward to a dialogue.
Great. Thank you again. We're going to meet again next Tuesday at the same time, at the same link, with the same teacher. Thank you so much, Ilan.
Thank you, Emmanuel.
Bye-bye.